Yes, so good afternoon, good evening once again. The title of this afternoon's presentation is The Guyanese Diaspora in the Time of Petroleum and Climate Change. Clearly, the breaking off of the iceberg, that massive chunk of ice that occurred fairly recently, reminds us of climate change. And had you had an opportunity to look at the papers today, you'd have seen that ExxonMobil has announced yet another find, this time in the Payara block, 500 million barrels of oil, bringing to a total, in the entire Stabroek block, the find to be 2.25 to 2.75 billions of barrels of oil. So this afternoon will be addressed by Professor Jay Mandel, who has written very many articles and books, among which are Globalization and the Poor, a Cambridge publication, The Roots of Black Poverty, the Southern Plantation Economy After the Civil War, and one of his earliest books, The Plantation Economy, Population and Economic Change in Guyana. Jay is an economic historian, a preeminent social scientist, and an absolutely wonderful example of an economist. So without any further ado, except perhaps to say that, Jay, your roots are essentially in the Caribbean, and that, as far as I'm concerned, you are a member of the Caribbean, and particularly the Guyanese diaspora. I ask you to address us on the subject. Thank you.
What you should know is that Thomas Singh was one of my best students when he was a graduate student at Temple University. Thank you, Thomas. It's late. We're tired. I hope to say some things that will stir the blood. I'm not afraid of disagreements. Right. In the not too distant future, it is highly likely, though not certain, that Guyana will become an important petroleum exporter. The estimates that have been offered concerning the income that will flow to the country vary widely, but whatever level occurs, the revenue could well allow a future Guyanese president to remark, as Dr. Eric Williams is reputed to have done, that money is no problem when it comes to the public sector spending. The hard reality, however, is that though petroleum money might eliminate the government's financial constraints, petroleum alone cannot produce economic development. The offshore platforms used by energy corporations like ExxonMobil employ only a relatively small number of workers, many of whom are expatriates. Despite this, the petroleum sector does possess the potential to initiate a positive development dynamic to the Guyanese economy, but this can occur only if two conditions are satisfied. First, the energy companies must accord local firms the opportunity to provide it with services and inputs. And second, those local firms must be able to respond effectively to those needs. The argument in this paper is that members of the diaspora could play an important role in creating such a dynamic relationship. In doing so, overseas-based Guyanese can provide both investment funds, and technical expertise to the local private sector. But, just as importantly, they can also act as agents of institutional and policy reform, changes that are needed in the country before it can sustain modern economic growth. Providing domestic content, that is products and services to the petroleum industry, is not easily accomplished. As a World Bank study points out, an economy that is very limited can hardly be expected to quickly supply services. A vicious circle is involved here. With no experience in providing services to a sector such as petroleum, local firms have not learned how to satisfy industry requirements. But if they are unable to meet those requirements, they will be shut out from selling to those firms and will therefore be denied the experience necessary for learning. Neighboring Trinidad and Tobago's involvement in providing domestic content to the energy sector demonstrates both the promise and the pitfalls that are involved. On one hand, the need to achieve high levels of performance in quality and price has resulted in the fact that, as two authors have put it, the local energy services sector is the most competitive in Trinidad and Tobago's economy. These authors report that a competitive assessment carried out by the Ministry of Trade and Industry identified energy services as, quote, the only internationally competitive service section of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. Furthermore, the country's petroleum and natural gas sector has provided the feedstock for new industries producing ammonia, methane, and urea. But Trinidad and Tobago's success in providing services to the petroleum firms should not be exaggerated. Though no comprehensive study of the importance of this subsector in the economy exists, Nazira Hack has examined the role played by Trinidad and Tobago domestic suppliers in 4 important pipeline projects in that country. His calculations suggest that local content accounted for only 18% of the total amount spent on the projects he examined. Hack does not provide an explanation for this limited achievement, but the World Bank provides insight when it notes that though the Trinidad and Tobago government has articulated a policy in support of domestic content, quote, implementation remains piecemeal, and local content requirements are not integrated into the government's regulatory activities. It does not happen automatically. The fact that even after a century of experience, Trinidad and Tobago's petroleum servicing sector still fills only a fraction of the market that is potentially available to it suggests the magnitude of the task that confronts Guyana. The Guyanese private sector has not been disciplined by the need to adjust to high-tech markets. The country is a commodity producer, not a source of manufactured products, where efficient methods of production are required in order to compete successfully. But unless an upgrade occurs in Guyana, a debilitating mismatch will exist between petroleum's quality and price requirements on one hand, and the capacity of local firms to satisfy those standards on the other hand. An important reason for the shortfall in Guyana's private sector is the profound brain drain, which we've heard so much about today, that the country has experienced in recent years. In 2010, the last year for which data are available, it is reported that virtually every Guyanese, 93%, who possess a tertiary level education, live outside of the country. The loss of human capital that the exodus of college-educated women and men represent accounts in large part for the fact that Guyana stands at a very low level in the 2015-16 Global Competitive Index, where ranking 1 is best and 140 is worse. The unfortunate fact is that Guyana ranks 108th with regard to this variable, reliance on professional management in the private sector. It is true that members of the diaspora are not indifferent to the needs of those they have left behind. Remittances in 2014 came to 11% of the country's gross national income. But with regard to development, the educational and technical skills that the country needs in order to provide high levels of services to a technologically sophisticated industry like petroleum are only to a limited extent present in the country. Now, paradoxically, it is precisely the massive relocation of highly educated Guyanese to metropolitan countries that has created a mechanism that could help to overcome the country's handicap in this regard. Guyana's diaspora could be a source of the entrepreneurial competence, technical skills. I just lost my page, wait a minute. Coming. Found it. If members of the diaspora were to fill the role of providing competence, technical skills, and capital, it would be possible for a modern energy servicing industry to grow and mature in the country. What is needed is the willingness of wealthy members of the diaspora to provide the funding and perhaps even more importantly, the mentoring that would allow local firms to learn to be more productive. In short, Guyana needs venture capitalists. These are individuals who risk their funds in the anticipation that their managerial interventions will improve the profitability of local firms and consequently yield high returns for themselves. An absence of data makes it impossible to provide a definitive answer to the question of how many such individuals actually exist. There is no census of overseas Guyanese. The only source that can provide relevant information is a 2013 World Bank publication. This data source does not offer great optimism concerning the role that the diaspora can play in Guyanese development. Only a handful of West Indians appearing in the World Bank survey possess the wealth and competence needed to fill the venture capitalist role. Only 4%, that is 14 individuals out of the 349 who responded to the survey, listed private equity and venture capital as one of the top 3 sectors with which they were most familiar. Not only is this a small number, but it is not clear how many of the 14 would be interested in opportunities in Guyana. Nevertheless, the survey does suggest that there are at least a few members of the diaspora who could fill the entrepreneurial role that Guyana needs. Whatever the number, it will be the responsibility of the Guyanese government to attract these individuals and their managerial competence as well as their investable funds to the country. But as things stand, Guyana is poorly positioned to convince venture capitalists to invest in firms in the country. It ranks poorly on many of the measures that would be of interest to such individuals. In the Global Competitive Index, Guyana is ranked 109th with respect to protection of property, 106th with respect to intellectual property protection, 104 irregular payments and bribes, 102 transparency of government policy making, 111 business costs of crime and violence, 129, reliability of policy services. 121, ethical behavior of firms. 119, strength of auditing and reporting standards, etc., etc. The list is long. Each of these represents an aspect of the country's investment climate that would likely discourage all but the most adventurous venture capitalists. Nevertheless, the fact is that the entry of even a handful of intrepid investors might be sufficient for Guyana to get a modernization project underway. Market opportunities presented by a firm like ExxonMobil could induce risk-tolerant venture capitalists to seek to strengthen firms endeavoring to service the petroleum giant. Their entry could result in the breakthrough the country needs. That breakthrough would occur, but only if the managers and employees who work in the Diaspora-supported firms both succeed economically and also become advocates of reform to improve the country's standing in the global competitive index. Their participation as advocates of reform would in the first instance be in the name of their own self-interest, and they would lobby and press for example, strengthening the protection of property rights and minority shareholder interests, because that's how they would gain. But the point is that if such reforms actually were implemented, the resulting gains would extend beyond their narrow self-interest to the benefit of the country as a whole. If Guyana, under pressure from economically progressive members of the diaspora, materially improved its standing in the global competitive index, a positive development dynamic could emerge. Additional new industries might come to life. Their doing so would further strengthen the reform efforts as the managers and employees in those new sectors join the cause. A virtuous circle could replace the negative one the country has experienced for too long. None of this is certain. The giant oil companies might not provide a market for domestic service providers. Intrepid entrepreneurs might not appear. Even if the energy firms were willing to buy local, they still might not come. And of course, the economic reform effort could prove to be an exercise in frustration. The latter, after all, would constitute a reversal of deeply ingrained patterns of policy formation and behavior. But though there is no certainty that a pattern of self-reinforcing gains will occur, there is at least a chance that it might. And if it does, the Guyana that we know today might become unrecognizable. For economic development to occur in Guyana, then, it will not be sufficient for those in the diaspora to confine themselves to supplying remittances to the country. To have a transformative impact, they will have to act as investors, mentors, and political actors, taking advantage of the opportunities that emerge for local firms to become domestic sources of supply to the petroleum sector. Overseas Guyanese will have to play a part in the technical and financial strengthening of the private sector, and at the same time, they will have to participate in the country's political process as agents of reform. Achieving economic development is never solely an economic phenomenon, and Guyana will not be an exception to that reality. thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Mandel, for a presentation that obviously went straight to the issues. We have those issues identified and would now welcome questions. Professor will be happy to answer questions. Yes, please.
It's not so much a question. I heard your statistics on the lack of members in the diaspora who would be able to come home to mentor, to invest. You said that there's no data that provides for information on persons with that capability. I have 30 years in the oil and gas industry. I know there are other people who are here also in that industry. For us, it's not so much not wanting to come, but there hasn't been an invitation per se. And I have not worked in the field, but I have worked in regulatory, in the administration. I've worked heavily with FERC, and I understand a number of the policies and the principles with regard to the extraction and doing the business of itself. It sounds kind of gloom and doom, all of the statistics that you presented, and it makes it seem like we should run from this rather than go towards it. I haven't even heard anyone mention either the aspect of teaching us to look at investing in Exxon so that when we come to the table, we're not just these people who they're coming in to reap from, but we can talk to them as shareholders at their table. I increased my stock with Exxon once I saw them getting into Guyana. I'm looking at retiring soon. I want to wear dual hats. So I understand the doom and gloom, but what incentive and what invitations have we heard to bring us in other than the few of those who have already been here, working with, mentoring, teaching, and helping with moving forward? We have 5 years. From what you say, it sounds as though we would not be prepared with that 5 years to learn even the basics to get a jump on what is possibly coming here in the oil and gas industry.
Not true, not true.
Those are very good comments. I remind you all that the economics profession is known as the gloomy or dismal science. I want to make several points about that. I don't think that it is realistic to think that individual, relatively small-scale businesses are going to be able to do the entry and mentoring that I think is necessary. I want to repeat the point that the way firms learn to be globally competitive is by being the exporters of products, and either they fail or they succeed based upon their productivity. So the first point that I was making was these are very rich individuals. These venture capitalists are not just normal business people. And as I understand it, that mentoring and financial role has to be played by somebody who has the ability to risk very large amounts of money. Point two, I absolutely agree that the government has an extremely important role to play in attracting the kind of people that will do the mentoring and the financing. And the reason I gave all those horrible statistics from the Global Competitive Index is to indicate the scale of the reform that is necessary in order for that attraction to be effective. Third, and I mean, we'll have a nice argument about this, but I doubt very much that the scale of stock purchase of ExxonMobil will be able sufficiently to enable individual investors to have a big impact on that firm. I doubt that very much. What I do think is possible, and it's at the moment it's a contentious point, is for the government to engage in serious negotiations in order to extract not just the maximum amount of revenue that can be generated for the local government as opposed to the firm, but to make conditions such that the supply of services and products by local firms is ensured. Economic development is ultimately a process of learning. Firms learning how to produce and be able to sell successfully in markets over the world. So to me, of course, the level of revenue is very important, but the conditions that can be established in which purchases are from local firms, so long as the local firms produce according to quality and price standards, that to me is an extremely important part of this, because that's where the learning will occur.
Hello.
Where are you?
Yeah, thank you very much for the statistics.
Okay.
They are indeed powerful and real. And we do have to implement reforms in those areas for global competitiveness to improve, so that we are indeed within the global scale of being competitive. And that will take many years to accomplish that. I think that's a fact. One of the things that you mentioned is a term that none of us have mentioned during the past 2 days that has to do with the diaspora, and it's very, very powerful. And that's diaspora advocacy or activism. If we are going to effect any change in reforms and policies. And so that you mentioned it is powerful there. Here's a question for you on a financial area. What are your thoughts about the securitization of future cash flows through the oil?
I'm worried about it. I'm worried in general because the needs are so great. And so deferring the payoff into the future, I have a concern. Obviously, you don't know that. My adopted son was from St. Vincent and became a professional basketball player, became very rich, far more wealthy than his father. And so I understand the need to have a conservative portfolio, and preservation of capital is very important. The needs are very great in Guyana, and the claims on those resources will be substantial and really would not easily put off into the future. And so, as I say, revenue is very important, expenditures will be high. None of that speaks to the issue that I'm really concerned about, is how the private sector in Guyana will learn to be progressive.
I think you have outlined one model of development. And Guyana is just at the embryonic stage of the oil industry. Exxon is just one block. There are many other blocks out there. And the paradigm can change dramatically from what it is now. What about a scenario in which Guyana establishes its own national oil company? And in establishing its own national oil company, to stop giving out any other license to explore in other blocks. Guyana own it, and it partners with other national oil companies, probably like Norway or Petrobras, etc., to develop that expertise in which it could quadruple or very quickly catch up in the market in terms of technology, innovation, and managerial expertise. Exxon is a phenomenon which we never expected, and we now are trying to catch up with it. But a growth stage in going forward can be totally different. Therefore, your prediction may be rather pessimistic. We're much more optimistic here again.
It pains me to not agree with that. It pains me, but I can't, because the technical requirements of that industry are so demanding that I am not sure that a local-owned petroleum industry could compete successfully. I say it, I'm not sure. I'll say it more strongly, I doubt it. The history of publicly owned firms in this industry is not stellar, both because of technical problems and also because of the problem of corruption. I lived in Guyana in the 1970s when the bauxite industry was nationalized, and it was a thriving industry with limits, of course. It did not produce alumina at that time. It certainly didn't produce products. But there was a problem of the staffing of the firm when it shifted to public ownership. And without predicting that that's what would happen, it certainly is a risk. And so the political risk involved, plus the problem of whether there are sufficient technical skills present to run such an industry, leaves me, and as I say, pains me to say this, very skeptical that that could work.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation. I see the oil industry in Guyana more as a political economy challenge. I'm more concerned about the role of the state. I have very in-depth experience about Venezuela because I spent 2 years going around the oil camps of Venezuela, and I wrote the history of the Venezuelan oil workers and their contribution to the democratization of the Venezuelan state from 1918 to 1948. Then subsequently, I did a research on oil nationalization and who benefits. And I had access to the technological contracts, to the commercial contracts, and a number of other contracts in which I came to the conclusion that the transnational corporations were benefiting more after nationalizing than before. I also continued to follow Venezuela onto the period now of Chavez. I was at the election of Maduro, and because I wrote about the oil workers, I'm a very good friend of the petroleum unions in Venezuela. They invited me. The other experience I have is with Nigeria. In 2013, I went to Dubai, and I did a workshop with Nigerian officials from the NNPC, the National Petroleum Company. Spending a week with Nigerian officials in a workshop for a week is an extraordinary experience about what happens in Nigeria. Okay, so in both cases, but I'll focus a bit more on Venezuela, because as you mentioned bauxite, it is now 100 years since we had bauxite. And I have written a booklet on the nationalization of both bauxite and sugar. So I have a very good idea of what you're talking about in terms of the bauxite. But let's go back to the oil industry. It's one, I'm not making a question. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to make a comment. We need an interaction. He has one approach, I have another one. Now hear what it is. I do not believe we have an oil curse, whether it's Nigeria or whether it's Venezuela. I think we have a governance curse. And I think oil was a blessing given to these nations. How the leadership of those countries used it, and how they invested it, and what they did with it, that is the issue. Now, I believe there is going to be, and I've looked at it in Venezuela, And I know what our capabilities are in Guyana and within the diaspora. I have a sense of it, a very strong sense. There's going to be a learning curve before we get down to the downstreams. It's going to take at least a decade to get a little foothold into that. It's a process. Meanwhile, what does the state do with the income that will come in? That is the key question. That is the key question. Now, unless we have a state that is modernized and that is robust, and that is accountable and transparent, we are going to make the same mistakes of Venezuela, and we'll make the same mistakes of Nigeria. Now, I don't want to go into more detail. So I believe, and this is where my interest is, that the diaspora, having lived outside of Guyana, and having seen how modern states function, that there's a very important contribution for them to make in contributing to the modernization of this state, so that it could be ready in the short term to be able to attend to the income that would be coming. Now we have a problem here.
Thank you.
The last point, the diaspora is as polarized as the ethnic groups inside Guyana, and in that case, they will not be able to make a contribution to making the Guyanese state a modernized, robust state to deal effectively with the oil revenue. That is a challenge of the diaspora.
Let me just react to that. We agree more than you think we do. The point I was thinking I was emphasizing and want to now re-emphasize is I think it is true that the diaspora should, if it's going to fulfill a progressive mission with regard to development, has to provide resources, has to provide mentoring, and has to act as a political agent so that the economy is not hamstrung by all the bureaucratic and difficult things that businesses face. If in a decade it were true that the stock of skills in the country were sufficient to support a domestic petroleum industry, I would be entirely in favor of that, but it is an open question. But as to what I thought was the controversial part of my presentation is that it will not be sufficient for the diaspora to confine itself to mentoring the providing of resources. It has to have a political role, and I agree also that if it doesn't fill that role, not a whole lot of economic development will occur.
So thank you. There were two more, and then we'll finish. You and MP Lamy.
Hi, Jay Keith, okay, the campus, UWI. When we were conceptualizing this conference, we were emphasizing the point that we should be talking about a Caribbean diaspora rather than nation diasporas. Because I think the key point that you're making is that just transferring the problem of a small nation by adding a small diaspora to it doesn't change the equation in any significant way. But whether we are debating this question or not really doesn't matter, you know. Because on the flight coming from Trinidad to here, I'm Trinidadian, Trinidad and Tobago, and I come from a petro state. I serve on the Economic Development Advisory Board for the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. I could tell you all the challenges of a petro state. And many of the discussions I've heard over the last 2 days are premised on a notion of what oil and gas and resources can do for the economy, which are flawed. So I take your point. You've made the point exceptionally well. The key thing is this. There are a number of firms from Trinidad that are already here. The banks are here. The oil and gas companies are here. So whether we debate the issue, right, what is happening is there's an organic process of investment coming from Caribbean people wherever they are. What we should be thinking about is how do we tap into the Caribbean society and community wherever they are, in the Caribbean or outside of the Caribbean. That is what is going to change the equation, because we move from having small states to having something of a medium-sized, small to medium-sized economic set of resources that we can draw on. So I just wanted to make that point and tell you thanks very much for the very sobering presentation.
Thank you.
That's a really important point. That in Trinidad and Tobago, the experience with the industry has created skills and competencies that are complementary to the needs in this country. I came to the Caribbean in the generation that was very concerned with Caribbean integration. And Lloyd Best taught me that the reason that there was no, or very incomplete integration, was there was no organic basis in the economy and there was no politics of integration. But here is a perfect example of where the skills that are created in one could cement the ties between the two to the benefit of each. Because the firms in Trinidad and Tobago would benefit by providing services to the Guyanese, and the Guyanese certainly would be benefiting from the mentoring that would come from the skills from Trinidad and Tobago. To some extent, therefore, the role that I assigned to the venture capitalists could be taken over by people in Trinidad and Tobago who have the complementary skills and the ability to mentor Guyanese. I take your point entirely on that.
Thank you. MPI.
It relates to some of the questions that have been asked, but what would be your expectation of any advisory group and any sovereign wealth fund that is set up by Guyana? Would you expect Guyana to reach into the Guyanese diaspora? What is the sort of competencies you would hope to see if in the short term Guyana is to invest with the kind of, in its own economy, so that it's at least prepared, not 2020, but 2030 and 2040. Other countries, and I've sort of met sovereign wealth funds, the Norwegians, the Australians and others, have done that successfully.
My temptation is to take you up on what you said earlier, which was you don't want to get too much into the weeds of the politics of the country. And the truth of the matter is, this is in the first instance a question of will and recognition. At the moment, I don't sense that. I don't sense that the country at the moment is ill-equipped to take advantage of the opportunities that are being presented. So my first reaction to this is to say the detail of the institutional mechanisms is not as important right now as the recognition that the diaspora has this three-pronged role to play, and it will be the tribunality of the government to reach out and gain access to those three aspects of it. I've been doing these kind of lectures for some time now, and in fact I'm going to do another one tomorrow night in Moray House. The big encouragement, well, okay, you all know that the Guyanese people are a very political people. And you cannot talk to any Guyanese who does not have an opinion about politics. We should have heard the taxi driver coming in from the airport. What I think is that petroleum, and this was not part of my presentation, what I think is that petroleum ultimately has the potential for being a unifying issue. I think that the prospect of what can be done with this industry and the potential that is present here has the possibility of transcending the awful ethnic divisions that have so hamstrung the country in the past. There really is the possibility of a change in the political agenda, away from communal politics to national development politics, because it's such a realistic possibility. There really is a way for this country to go forward, and I think that with the help of the diaspora promoting the kinds of reforms that would advance economic development, it is possible that the ethnic divisions could, there's no guarantee of this, and it may even be a low probability, but this looks to me like the possibility of a transition, a change in course that's possible for this country. A lot will now go back to the question of, will the politicians, or will it require a new generation of politicians to seize the opportunity and transcend the past?
I sincerely apologize to you, ma'am, and to everyone else, but who has further questions, but the Vice Chancellor and others have been prevailing on me that we ought to end at this stage. My sincere apologies. I'd like to thank you for your attention, for your questions, and for the discussion in which you engaged. Let me say that Professor Mandel J. ended on a rather optimistic note for those of us who are worried, in that he suggested that petroleum, rather than being the resource curse that we know it, might be a blessing. Additionally, I'd like to thank Jay himself for an excellent presentation. Whenever I hear you, Jay, I always wonder whether I prefer your presentation or the discussion that is generated by your presentation, followed by your rather masterful self-moderation of the discussion. So I'd like to thank everyone and bid you a very good evening, handing you over to my sincere, I wasn't duly prepped. My most sincere apology. Been fully apprised of this, but the next presentation will be done by Dr. Norman Monroe of Florida International University. I detected a Guyanese accent, Dr. Monroe, and welcome you to do your presentation, doubly because of that accent. Ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I happen to be the last speaker before dinner, so I'm going to do what I normally do to the classes that I teach at Florida International University. Being a school that has a lot of students who work during the day, and late in the afternoon when you have to teach them, it's hard to keep them awake, so I'll try to make it a little lively. I actually had to change the title of my presentation. This was trying to be professionally correct and not to annoy the Honorable Minister Raphael Trotman. I used the term exploitation, deep water exploitation, and I realized that that's no longer a term they use in the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission. So here we go with the sustainable development of deep water oil and natural gas, a roadmap for technical assistance. I'd like to thank my postdoc who put these slides together. My involvement with deep water exploration started in 2006. And this occurred on January 23rd as part of the Security and Prosperity Partnership for Hydrocarbons Working Group when it held its first workshop. And this workshop was basically to look at the challenges related to the exploration and production of deep water resources. And I'm going to define deep water resources and ultra deep water resources a little later. The expertise that assembled in that day came from academia, government officials from Canada, Mexico, the US, and representatives from several oil companies. And this was a partnership with Florida International University, of which I was the director of the Applied Research Center at that time, and a sub-center, which was the Center for Energy and Technology of the Americas. So in partnership with Baker Institute at Rice University and the Center for Energy and Economics from the University of Texas, we coordinated this workshop. Since then, I've been working with Aramco in the training of some of their graduate engineers who worked with the company, particularly as it deals with corrosion prevention of oil and gas pipelines in their very acidic soil conditions in Saudi Arabia. So the overview of this presentation will deal with the Mid-Atlantic Ocean region and the potential thereof, current deep water resources and the challenges and technologies, and I'm going to talk about some case studies in newly emerging petrostates, and then the conclusions. This slide shows worldwide offshore oil and gas resources and how they are becoming of importance, with major deposits being discovered off the coasts of Brazil, about 175 billion barrels potential production, Ghana, between 5 to 7 billion barrels, and Guyana, as I just found out, about 2.4 or 2.7 billion barrels. And if you look at this schematic here, you will see the red blurbs showing the Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, and the West African coast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola. And if it weren't for the continental drift, you could see that there would be a large deposit pool if you brought those continents together. So let's look at this recently discovered deep water resources. So Brazil's subsalt oil fields could render the country a major crude exporter with sales around 2 million barrels per day. And then on the other hand, it's a mirror image when you go from the coast of one continent to the coast of the other continent. It's like a mirror image. So on the west, you have the African coast and lots of deposits, like I mentioned, Nigeria, Ghana, Angola. But Brazil's deep water resources are expected to contribute about 11 million barrels per day of new non-OPEC oil versus 7 million barrels per day from OPEC countries by 2035. This is a projection of BP. So the new floating production units that Brazil hoped to have would be part of 8 that will be installed offshore Brazil over the next 2 years, according to Petrobras investment plan. And they will be going after what we call ultra deep water resources. And it would account for about 50% of Brazil's total crude output. So I tried to summarize in this table recently discovered deep water resources of oil and natural gas, but I'm only mentioning oil, not natural gas or oil equivalent. So when you look at Brazil, it's projected to have about 2.8 million barrels per day. The depths at which they're working is the ultra deep. Anything over 2,000 meters is in the ultra deep configuration. And they're using the floating production storage offloading units. In the case of Brazil, they currently have leased 6 FPSOs, and they have 3 others under construction. Ghana has a lot of gas and some oil production. It's not to the stage that they had anticipated. They were anticipating a higher production of about 120,000 barrels per day, but they're nowhere near that. Guyana, that little dash should be about 2.7, and the depth is about 1,500 meters. It shows the FPSO capacity processing of about 120,000 and the storage capacity. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, you have the U.S. Gulf of Mexico and U.S. Gulf of Mexico, and Mexico Gulf of Mexico. The thing about Mexico is that they have about 232 fixed production platforms, but they operate in very shallow water, less than 200 meters. They only have 1 FPSO and 1 storage vessel. Ghana has 3 FPSOs, Kwame Nkrumah, John Evans at the Mills, and John Buford. I'll talk a little bit about the problems they're having in their production. Well, most of you are familiar with Guyana's offshore basin, so I'm going to move on with that. And we heard about the recent discovery today. So I want to move on to deep water variable definition, because over the years, the definition of deep water and ultra deep has been changing. See, before, over 300 meters were considered deep water, and over 1,500 meters was considered ultra deep water. And the definition has changed to about 500 meters for deep water and 2,000 meters ultra deep water. So Guyana's Liza fields are just on the fringe of what we call deep water or ultra deep water. And one may think, okay, you know, if you're operating at 200 meters and now you're going to over 200 to 3,000 meters, you use the same type of technology. And so the question posed a little bit earlier of getting into the same exploration and production is a challenging one, and I'm going to outline some reasons why. For example, in 2006, when we had this workshop, there were only 6 drilling rigs in the world capable of putting wells in the ultra-deep mode. And it was projected by 2010, there would have only been 20 in the entire world. So when it comes to the technology working at those depths, where you have low temperatures, high pressure, and you're trying to convey from the wells to a vessel or to the land, it's very challenging. So let's look at some of the new deep water technologies. There are the need for things like deep draft semi-submersibles. I also already mentioned the floating production, storage, and offloading vessels. For example, having them constructed, you have to go to places like Singapore and other places in the world and retrofit existing vessels, double hull, and a lot of capabilities. The extension leg platform types, new designs for storm events. Hopefully, we don't have severe storm events in our coast, but in the Gulf of Mexico, it's a major issue. Floating liquefied natural gas, gravity-based systems, these are things for development of the gas fields that must be considered. And when you get to ultra deep water, the tethering and tendon moorings, and now we're moving to carbon fiber materials for lightness, because when you're going very deep, you have to handle a lot of weight. So new technology is currently being developed all the time. So there's a great need for high strength, low weight, spool reel installation and multi-phase pumps and all that type of technology. Now this is a schematic of a floating production storage offloading, and it shows a variety of lines, umbilical lines, production lines, gas injection, water injection, just to have the movement of the resource. So this is just basically a schematic showing challenges and what's happening underground. Countries like Norway try to do everything on the water. You hardly see anything on the surface. So that's how sophisticated the technology can become. So a little bit about the challenges and technologies. So a lot of times you have limited and uncertain data in deep water resource management, reservoir performance. I know in the case of Ghana, they started a well and they were hoping to have a certain level of production, and before you know it, the performance was not what they anticipated. You have problems with fluid characteristics, sweet, sour, system flexibility, operation performance, of course, offshore facilities and flow assistance. Not to mention environmental issues and health and safety for workers. So one has to have cost-effective development of these new opportunities, and it will require new technologies to cope with the above challenges. Talking about environmental safety concerns, no one has forgotten the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, which occurred in April 2012, which caused the deaths of 11 persons, spilled nearly 5 million barrels of oil, killed untold numbers of wildlife, and deposited environmental time bombs in coastal areas. And so, one has to be very cognizant that you can have lots of accidents with the loss of life, ecological disasters on the coastlands, and obviously one has to monitor disposal practices of drilling cuttings. The fluids and chemicals that are used, would they pose a problem to the environment and to wildlife or to the ecosystem? Compliance to safe operating practices and contingency measures. Effective emergency response measures. We can learn a lot from Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm sure they have trained personnel that can respond. Avoiding oil spills. And I know in Saudi Arabia they had major problems with gas hydrates. In fact, that was supposed to be one of the reasons for accelerated corrosion of their pipelines, which I had the pleasure of assessing a variety of corrosion inhibiting coatings to minimize corrosion. What about environmental safety concerns? Guyana has zero capacity to fight or mitigate any of the effects of even the smallest spill offshore. So these are opportunities. It would require the EPA or a specialized agency comprising of marine biologists, petroleum experts, and a team dedicated to fight all types of challenges. So Guyana must take full charge of its own responsibility. Forest allotments from oil production revenues must go towards entrenching environmental protection and safety. One has to fortify EPA to discharge its mandate. And other environmental risks include air quality and climate. I'm sure you've seen images of the venting of natural gas or burning of natural gas in many parts of the world. Marine water quality, protected areas and other sensitive habitats, human and ecological health, archaeological and cultural heritage resources. Those are concerns. So other possibilities would include the establishment of a standing committee of Parliament on oil and gas, considering the likely importance to the economy of this sector. Human resource development is very, very important for Guyana to really benefit. The Honorable Minister of Natural Resources said in a television interview that Guyana could be susceptible to the resource curse. I'm sorry to have to mention that because we want to be optimistic tonight. But this can be brought on by the sudden oil wealth and potential corruption. Like many underdeveloped countries, Guyana has no experience and few resources to handle taxation, regulation, and environmental control related to energy production. So the challenge again would be to identify necessary skills and challenges, develop a global training strategy, engage local skilled workforce, attract entry-level talented young people, including women, coordinate retention strategies such as decent wages, career development support, and good working conditions. This was a major problem in Ghana, where you had lots of strikes for local industries affiliated with their oil exploration because of wages, and so you had disruption of production. That's why they couldn't meet their goals. Towards the development of future technologies, one could look at a case study in Brazil that shows that a strategic partnership based on strong interaction between oil and gas industry and academia has created favorable conditions for the development of new technologies. I say that to say that we could look at the best practices of recently emerging petrostates and adopt some of those best practices. Occupational safety and health training for contract and subcontract workers should be the same. This was not the case in Ghana again. Governments, employers, and workers have a mutual interest in maximizing occupational safety and health and environmental protection. So one has to look at strategic global framework agreements or international framework agreements within multinational companies and other oil industries. For example, the GFA at Lukoil and Statoil includes provisions for safety and health protection of contract and subcontract workers working for these multinational enterprises, so as to better understand the human factors. So fostering the safe and healthy environment should be the primary focus. Deepwater offshore regulations. This slide here shows what happened after the disaster in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. After placing, there was a moratorium that was placed on drilling permits. And the number of rigs drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico plunged from roughly 30 in April to as low as 4 in September. So you can have long and arduous permit approval processes, and so that can be a major challenge if you try to do that on your own. It's one of those things that one has to look at. I wanted to look at the number of times operators lost control of a well and experienced a fire or logged many other types of accidents. And it shows that over the years, it's been decreasing. As far as regulations go, there are case studies that one can look at. For example, Brazil learned from Norway. And Norway has some of the world's most stringent rules when it comes to deepwater exploration. So both own similar legal framework, that is both Brazil and Norway. Colombia, which is not a major oil producing nation, but it has some very progressive regulations. And they've done this in order to attract international investors. Some examples are royalty changes from fixed 20% to a sliding scale depending on the quality and the level of production. So the government takes on profit based on quality and production of crude oil and the distance from the shore. They have minimum depreciation period, and it's reduced by the government from 10 years to 5 years, favoring the oil and gas operators. So lessons learned and what Guyana must carefully adapt include adoption of new deepwater regulations based upon the experience of other countries, build a strong foundation of good regulatory policy, show commitment by establishing local presence of service personnel. A little bit about the experience learned from countries which could serve as a roadmap for Guyana. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ghana, again, being a new emerging petrostate. They passed regulations, the parliament, with the main objective to ensure that Ghanaians would have an opportunity to be part of the country's natural resource activities and benefit from it, thereby improving their standard of living. So they passed regulations and worked with the companies operating there to ensure that they paid attention to having Ghanaians participate, like welding on the FPSOs and on-land activities, etc. Territorial disputes will be another area where we'll have to learn from other nations. For example, Venezuela and Trinidad, they have to work out their situation, even with Barbados, Grenada. Guyana and Venezuela, we're waiting on an arbitrator to assist, first of all, in delineation of who owns what. So the border dispute, Guyana's oil development plans have been challenged by its neighbor Venezuela, which claims 40% of Guyana's territory in a border dispute that dates back since 1889. Several tribunals have since settled the argument in Guyana's favor. However, Venezuela, with its financial turmoil and Guyana's oil discoveries, has renewed its claims, which extend into the Atlantic. Another area that we can learn from is the US-Mexico in the Gulf of Mexico. So there is a huge offshore development contract between the US and Mexico. It stretches from the US-Mexico land border on the coast into the east central Gulf to the donut hole where the US and Mexico have signed a boundary treaty to divide their portion. So Cuba is the other party to this area, and treaties are still being negotiated for its boundaries. So lessons from other jurisdictions will provide valuable inputs into policy development and working models that could potentially be replicated in Guyana. And finally, I want to touch on the prospect of having natural gas for electricity generation. The generation of electricity is entirely fossil fuel based, and the majority of generation capacity comes from plants utilizing fuel oil or diesel. So we really look forward to the time when we can use natural gas or liquefied natural gas. So the Guyana government has approved $700,000 US for natural gas to electricity generation study, as reported in the Guyana Chronicle, as well as the Guyana Times. And Guyana is finalizing a study on how best to transport natural gas from Liza oil field to shore and to use it to fuel electricity generation, according to the Minister of Public Infrastructure, the Honorable David Patterson. Now that can be a challenge, of course, when you're 120 miles from the coast. Do you have a pipeline? That might not be economically feasible. You may have to have, again, floating liquefied natural gas production type of operation on site. Some countries like Angola, they've used semi-submerged pipelines onto the land for processing. Saudi Arabia also has pipelines about 50 to 100 miles offshore, all the way on land for processing of their fossil fuels, simply because it's not as sweet as ours. They have a lot of problems with sulfur, and so they need a lot of purification. So ExxonMobil quantifies the available natural gas to be about 50 to 60 cubic feet per day, which can provide about 200 megawatts of generation plant, according to Minister Trotman. And so in conclusion, deep water resource endowments are highly sought after prizes right now in the international oil and gas exploration arena for lots of reasons, because once you put the capital investment, the returns can be very, very huge and encouraging. In fact, of all the oil and gas production, approximately 30% was the amount that came from offshore. But that has shifted way up to probably over 50% of all the oil and gas being produced. So, and there are now efforts to go to 3,000 meters deep, for example, off the coast of Brazil, to find these resources. Human resource development is going to be very critical. So Guyana must take advantage of training by world-class programs in the USA, UK, Norway, and Brazil, and not to mention our own neighbor, Trinidad and Tobago. Technical training should be carried out in collaboration with oil companies and contractors. An emphasis has to be made from the government with these companies to ensure that Guyana enters or gets through the learning curve with a trained and skilled workforce to be able to be very productive in the not too far future. It would be necessary to implement regulations that could enable this sector to effectively contribute to our nation's energy security. We have to look at the lessons learned in places like Nigeria and to a lesser extent in Ghana, and look for best practices from other jurisdictions, because those can provide valuable input into policy development and working models that could potentially be replicated in Guyana. And finally, natural gas usage would lead to the reduction of oil imports and carbon emissions that will enable Guyana to meet its Paris Agreement pledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Just a couple of observations. I think such a top quality presentation should be more given from morning session. As I look around, I think I have respect for everyone that is here. I think we're all committed, but I would prefer to see much more persons listening to such a very interesting and important session. I think it would have done more justice to the presentation in itself because it is really important. When I listen to your presentation, I feel happy and I also feel very sad. Happy that Guyana is going into petroleum exploration, and sad that I'm wondering if they have the human resource capital that is ready for such a mighty exploration. I think it's quite challenging. Not too long ago, when I saw the Public Service Ministry advertise for scholarships, and I was looking for scholarships in those areas that you mentioned, and I didn't see many. So there's a lot of more work that we have to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Bill.
Did they consider using titanium instead?
For pipelines?
Yes.
The issue with the titanium, it's pretty expensive. I know it's highly corrosion resistant. You have issues with welding, etc. So it could be cost prohibitive, challenging when it comes to welding. So what they use is mild steel, but they coat it with corrosion resistant materials and different layers with acrylic. And there are specialized companies that manufacture these coated pipelines. In the case of Saudi Arabia, you have corrosion internally from the hydrates and externally from the acidic soils, very high in sulfates. And so we looked at a variety of pipelines with different types of coating, and we were able to characterize the nature of the coatings and could make recommendations in terms of which one was the most corrosion resistant. And so some of the students who did their research under my supervision returned to Aramco in Saudi Arabia and making that switch to the appropriate pipeline. But in terms of cost, it would be too expensive to go with titanium. But I do agree with you; it's corrosion resistant.
Any other?
I was just I happened to arrive in Nigeria in 1977, long time, along with Brigadier Ranger, luckily, and I was of course vocal in complaining about the lack of planning and the amount, 370 ships offshore, and when I want to tear away some money and so on, they had to ask for, to go to the World Court and ask for a reduction or an abolition of demurrage because they couldn't afford to pay it. They were dumping cement out at sea and so on. And it seems to me like a total crazy situation. And the Guyanese there who had organized Festac, by the name of Frank Pilgrim, he said you shouldn't be so quick to criticize. He said, I was here in 1960 when Nigeria got independence. And they had two metal strips along the main roads in Lagos and very little else outside of Lagos. I said, well, we had the same thing in Guyana. You only had two metal strips up to Edmore, for those who live in the country like me, or on the West Coast and so on, because they only go as far as the Sugar States. And he said, so you could see what they were trying to do. And I think this question of corruption, I'm sorry the Paul isn't here because I kind of have supported that what people were trying to do at that time was to satisfy all these needs that they had since 1960 in Nigeria, in the case of Nigerian independence. And so they were building universities and stadiums and all of it going like crazy. But what they had not done was to plan. And of course, what had happened around that time, just before, of course, the Biafran War, where there was a tremendous division. And really, the Igbos were given power in Nigeria by the British. But they had the oil down in the south and the east. So what happens is that the ones with the numbers, like the Yoruba and the Hausas, they had to beat them off to take over the oil. So it created that kind of confusion as to who would share in the wealth of the country. I think this is one of the problems we'll have in 2020 or 2025 or whenever we have elections again, because once you have that kind of cyclical changing or possible changing, you're going to have this problem. And as somebody mentioned, even if you bring in diaspora, it's the same thing. What we've got to do is to look at planning. And I think a part of this lecture said that it was not only, especially in the previous speaker, Dr. Mandel, I think there was some talk about climate change. And I think if we were to just plan what we're going to do with all this money we're going to get, and say, okay, we want to build a new capital, we want to go into hinterland, we want to do something like that, at least we have something national that says we can agree on something. And there's no reason why we should, this conference is so important. So if we can get people from the diaspora like yourself, the old Monroe family, of course, the old Marcus and so on. Because if you sat there like I did, I was lucky to be a reasonably senior officer at the time, and Brigadier Ranger too in Nigeria. And so we could have conversations within a military government. And these chats, it was remarkable how these fellows talked about why they were corrupt almost and how they were corrupt. It's almost amazing that you couldn't even believe it. And so once you don't have a plan, you'll do anything because basically you satisfy needs. Everybody wants a football stadium, a track field, arena, and more cinemas and more everything. So it's, I think we need to plan. And if you can bring the diaspora inside, I agree with Dr. Mandel, if you can get the diaspora involved, and this conference I think is a landmark conference, and it should be able to start that process. If we can do that, I think we can escape even Trinidad. I think it's happening in Trinidad. We can escape a lot of the problems we have with just spending money because we have needs.
Thank you. Yes.
The good thing we have is that we can look at the examples of countries and the mistakes they made. We can do that now and not repeat those mistakes.
Yes, please. I recognize another. One moment, please. Yeah. Do you have a mic? No, 1 second. 1 second, please.
I want to say thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to go direct to the question. Is there a feasibility study on a refinery, or are we going to use neighborhood Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a wonderful question.
Our money there.
That's a wonderful question. And just to go along with what the Honorable Minister Raphael Trotman said yesterday, that feasibility studies have been done and probably are being done right now. And preliminary findings is that to have a large refinery probably wouldn't be economically feasible, but small, medium-sized type of refinery could be something that can be explored not too far from 2025.
Thank you. Yep.
What I got to be about this whole affair, I don't see master plans being prepared for sectors. Do you know anything about master plans being prepared?
I don't have access to any other
In any master plans, infrastructure, energy, industrialization, in any master plans being prepared? I heard all sorts of different things about extraction and wealth fund and what have you. But to me, you should have serious, definitive master plans relative to how you're going to spend that money over time. So there is where you would require, we know how much expertise you will have in each specific area. Particularly, I'm interested in the 25,000 barrels per day because it will give our young people an opportunity to learn relative to the downstream petrochemicals off of the crude. That's what I'm interested in. For example, we have serious erosion control problems in Guyana. What I would like to see us develop a polymer that we can use our sand with, that is light, that we can line our trenches that don't have the nutrients of our agricultural soils in the trench. So in that context, 25,000 barrels a day, primarily for research, so we can learn over time. I rather suspect that Exxon is just scratching the surface.
I tend to agree with you. Remember I showed you that mirror image of what's happening off the coast of Africa and what's happening off the coast of South America. So you may want to extrapolate. So I wasn't surprised after the finding today, or the disclosure of the finding today. I'm expecting a lot more, especially when we get into ultra deep water. Remember, that's a new frontier, ultra deep, and only few countries have gone up there.
Thank you, Dr. Monroe. Is there another question or comment? Yes, there is.
Thank you. I just wanted to support the comment made by Colonel Roberts, which is that coming out of this very important conference, we need to have some recommendations concerning the planning for this momentous event when we would have all this money. And unless you know what you're going to do with it, indeed, we can get caught in all kinds of traps. I think it was mentioned earlier that later this week there are going to be tables. DC, you were saying tables with different subtopic areas, and I think elements of a plan, we've all been able to call that table, needs to be one of those 10, if you have not considered that already. A lot of stuff has been shared at this conference, and the importance of pulling all those strands of thoughts together needs to be emphasized and documented. So that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent suggestion. Yes, please, I certainly have to accommodate you.
You never have to. I am a little bit confused. And that's only because we were invited here by someone that has the utmost credibility for me, V.C. Griffith. And so my question is, would this august body be recognized by decision makers? Because it would have been a great vacation and a wonderful meeting of the minds. And then better catch your flight back to work.
My comment on that is, I don't know if you were here last year when we had the first conference. What I can tell you is the support that the Vice Chancellor has in the diaspora could be very impactful. And this being the second year, see that over 240 members from the diaspora convened here shows the respect that they have for the Vice Chancellor. Having said that, with this empowerment, the Vice Chancellor will know what to do, trust me.
Oh, lovely, lovely. You just relieved me. Thank you so much, VC. Because I've been treated to oblique references to the government and whether or not this is going to be organic. And in my simple mind, I'm thinking, wouldn't it have been the government who made the decision to engage Exxon? And therefore, there is something that the government is currently doing, and that the Vice Chancellor being part of the extension of that government, which we all are part of, the government is the people, that we are moving towards a cohesive whole. Is that something that I can expect?
I am optimistic that that's about to happen and is happening.
Okay, then I await it with bated breath.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's one final question here.
I really enjoyed the presentation about all the technical challenges and the sharing of different experiences of various countries. But I remember a speech made by the Honorable Forbes Burnham when he was talking about the potential of Guyana and the need to plan. And when we were going in the direction of what we used to call FCH, feed, hold, house, and clothe yourself. And he talked about the Nigeria experience with oil, where after they found oil, Nigeria, which used to be an exporter of food and always had a surplus, became a deficit in terms of agriculture because everyone wanted to go into the oil industry. And so they were importing food, and then when the prices of oil dropped, their situation became even more tenuous. So I'd like you to talk to that, because obviously the role of planning is very important in order to avoid those types of lessons.
What I can tell you is that it is very knowledgeable of failed petrostates with the administration at this point. And as I indicated in my talk a little earlier, the Honorable Minister did mention that we have to be careful of this curse that has afflicted other countries, having found oil and then to become totally dependent on that, with the ignoring other sectors of the economy. So we are conscious of that, and I'm sure with all the information availability around the world in terms of what's happening with other states, I would hope that the same mistake is not made in Guyana's case, and that adequate planning would be in place to put us in a good situation. I know as far as the University of Guyana is concerned, they're already taking steps in providing relevant training, relevant courses, introducing new programs, new areas of study to provide the workforce. And obviously planning will be part of that. So I'm optimistic that we wouldn't make the kind of mistakes that were made in Nigeria, and to a lesser extent in Ghana. Because in Ghana, they were hoping that the oil would bring jobs in the range of between 4,000 to 7,000. In reality, only about 400 to 700 people were employed in the FPSO operation off the coast. So that was like a tenth of what they had projected. So.
Dr. Monroe? I'd like to thank Dr. Monroe for an excellent presentation. To say sotto voce that a presentation like his would not have emanated from our Special Advisor on Petroleum. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation, an informative one. We have had a terrific evening. I am exercising tremendous self-restraint. So compliment me as I simply pass the microphone on to Vice Chancellor.
And for
such a wonderful job, Thomas, for giving entropy the food. Let me join in thanking Jay Mandel and Norman Monroe. Another final round of applause for them, please. We Guyanese have what is called stick-to-itivism. We have endurance, and we're going to test that endurance by going and getting our dinner as quickly as we can, and coming back here for the dinner session. There are 2 lines. I encourage you to go quickly, get your plate, get your